it really has been a fortunate opportunity for me to come out of Michigan with an engineering degree, go into the music industry, enter on the production and studio side, and find myself going all the way to the point of running one of the artist service and label groups inside of Warner. So I've had the good fortune of seeing day-to-day label and studio production operations, artist development. I actually led, created, and launched the global digital operations for the Warner Music Group, was head of all the commercial operations globally for Warner, especially during that painful transition from physical to digital retail, and then ended up running the label services group. So hopefully I can bring some of the label and artist management, artist development insights to the conversation. And I certainly never attempt to run at the Bob Stewart level of engineering or the core engineering team. I'm fortunate to be the dumbest guy in the company. Quick Mqa history. So Mqa began as a project partnership between Meridian Audio in the UK and the Warner Music Group. So I was still at Warner at the time, and Bob, who had co-founded Meridian, was over at Meridian doing pretty magical things. He and I first came together during DVD audio. I was part of the team that was driving DVD audio within the Warner Music Group, and Bob was leading what was then the Meridian lossless packing technology rollout. It was when there was an RFP and a bid process. MLP ultimately won that, and as many of you in the room probably know, MLP, Meridian Lossless, became the audio platform for high-resolution optical media, eventually became one of the key assets inside of Dolby, and Dolby's had a nice run with that technology as well. So we started working together on Mqa after having a long relationship around a number of other format iterations. It was not hard for the Warner Music Group to see fairly quickly that what we aspired for in the music space largely already existed because of the work that Meridian had done. In fact, going back to some of the key attributes of Mqa, the upfront filter encapsulation process, the music origami, which is the wonderful lossless packing process, and then the authentication and provenance were all characteristics of technologies that lived inside of what Bob had developed inside of Meridian. That meant we were able to take it to the other labels very quickly. We were able to get it out in front of artists. I spent the last 2 years probably of my life at Warner meeting Bob and other members of the Warner Music Group in out-of-the-way hotels where artists or managers might be touring and performing, and having them listen, give us feedback. It was a really exciting 2 years of iteration and continuous improvement where we largely got feedback from people who were making music to give us insight about their workflow, their processes, and the best way for the tools to be commercialized so that they could apply the technology of Mqa to what they were doing on a day-to-day basis. And I do assure you that that same curiosity and continuous improvement culture that we enjoyed before we rolled out the first version lives today inside of the Mqa engineering team. Our team, if you don't know, is based in Huntingdon, which is in Cambridge, about an hour outside of London. And it's a pretty wonderful workshop of people that are continuously improving on our technology, and their minds remain open. Finally, I should say before I get into the slides that I am no substitute for Bob Stewart talking about the technology that was developed, so I do encourage you, when you can, go to mqa.co.uk, check out Bob's blog there, which is Bob Talks. New things are going to be coming up very soon about statements on what analog to analog really means to Mqa and some other great additions there. So please take the time to read and view the videos, as well as check out all the AES papers that have been published on behalf of Mqa. All right, with that, let me see if I can navigate and talk. I was walking and chewing gum earlier, so I'm pretty optimistic. All I'm going to talk about here is, in a minute, even with the background that I gave you, me coming from a largely artist development or creative background, I'm about to give you one of the more sterile views of the music supply chain that I've ever done. Probably if I was sitting at Warner, some of you would throw it at me, but I think it's good to keep it clean and simple and more technology-centered so that we're really clear about the scope of Mqa, and I don't get too caught up in some of the nuances of the choices that artists make in terms of writing and producing. Okay, so this is one of the slides I'd like to really spend a minute with. There are a couple of things that we're trying to communicate here. At the core of it is an analog to analog message. So if you look at the top, that lossless target that you see, which really travels from the microphone feed to the analog playback, that's the goal that Bob set out from the beginning for Mqa. In fact, Underneath the technology and the original version were specific parameters that represented Bob's view and the engineering team's view about the impact that air transmission has on sound. Because the goal of MQA is to do nothing to the audio than what transmission through air would do to that audio. Which necessarily means we have to look at all of the things that would be unnaturally introduced in the chain because they wouldn't be there if this was traveling simply through air. So that's core to our view of an analog to analog chain. And it's why, as much as we absolutely respect conversations that go on in the market about lossless, we're having a different conversation about scope. And the traditional definition of lossless in the digital domain is too narrow to be able to address the impact that MQA is talking about and the scope that we're talking about. Now on the bottom of that slide, where it says MQA codec and MQA scope, that's the physical breadth of where our technology lives, from encapsulation all the way to the digital to analog converter at playback. And I'll get into a lot more of that in a second. So our goal is to have the impact from performance to analog vibrations in the air, and we do that in the space in the center. Good so far? I guess I'll leave you one additional thought, and I wrote it down because I wanted to make sure I said it this way. Sound always arrives as analog vibrations. And so we feel that a recording and a playback chain must mimic those properties. And I just want to say that again because that's the part I think that gets lost sometimes when we're talking about what we're doing. And that's why we're very comfortable as an enabling technology. And I know in the last session there were some questions about MQA versus COBAs. MQA is not a streaming service. We're an enabling technology that sits inside of music services as well as playback devices. And we are not only open to, but in discussions with just about everybody that has a content service or a playback device. So please see us as that ingredient brand in the marketplace rather than somebody who's competing against a particular streaming service. All right, here we go down one level. Now I know I did not know the size of my monitor, so I'm going to talk about this knowing you can't read some of these, but it's really illustrative anyway because I've generalized the chain. What I've done is I've taken that microphone to analog feed and now I've put the chip services, the very top which says typical A to D or A to D converter. Think about all the services that are living there, and the very bottom is the DAC. So we got chips on the top and the bottom, and then production processes and distribution processes in the center between production and playback. The point here is that this represents a number of stages that all either have filters or conversions going on. All opportunities, and I say that with a wink, all opportunities for artifacts to be introduced. It's also a great way to remind all of us that DACs are lossy, right? And so when we talk about wanting to get to an analog to analog experience, even if somebody successfully survives in the narrowly defined digital domain, it does not account for what's going to happen at the time of playback. And that's why MQA as a complete system, it's wonderful when the content is prepared as MQA, but the full effect is when it also runs into our technology at playback. That's how you get the full effect of getting back to the original analog, highest resolution, original studio quality sound. And so it's not necessary that you can read them. There's some floating point steps in there if anybody's interested in a couple of other steps, but I know it's hard to see from where you are. And I'm going to look at this now in a slightly different way. And I know you can see the red even though you can't necessarily see what it's circling. I mentioned authentication earlier. One of the reasons that authentication is so important for MQA, and Bob ensured its inclusion, was because during the early days of talking about this with artists and playing it for engineers, we consistently heard about what the move to digital consumption did to the creative community in terms of loss of control. There was a time in my life when I overseed physical manufacturing, and as much as I didn't like keeping track of all the stampers that I had in the plant to make the discs, there was a pretty clean forensic trail from the 1630 that I had in one hand, all my stampers and everything that was being created. So if an artist or an engineer wanted to know where was the 1630, what was made from it, how many do you have left, that was all well managed. In a digital world, once that production file is turned into a distribution file by an engineer, they've lost control. There's no audit trail, there's no accountability. And so the ability for us to introduce authentication in MQA, where at the time of playback by the consumer, we confirm for the consumer, and as a result of that also for the rights holder and the artist and the manager, that what they're getting is exactly what went into the encoding process. So I'll touch on that a couple more times, but that's why the A and MQA authentication to us is so central, and people have reacted to it. And this is where I'm going to do a clumsy transition to a quick video. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
So for us as the production team, MQA is a one-file format. It takes away any questions of doubt for the artist. The impact for the listener is to know that MQA is authenticated by the artist, that the artist is putting the seal of approval on the file format, that we're creating it here in the mastering room. We felt very lost over a number of years with digital audio, and this gives us control back.
Okay, that was, if you're not familiar with Mandy Parnell, if you're a Bjork fan, anything that you've listened to, Mandy probably has a hand in one of the great mastering engineers working. An early partner of MQA and somebody that really put the capital C in control in some of the early conversations that we were having. This is the same scope turned sideways to kind of isolate what we see as the traditional definition of lossless sitting in that digital domain. So to put an extremely overly fine point, on the left is the ADD, on the right is the DAC, and across all of those different data rates and chains, that kind of highlights the fact that defining lossless simply there misses the opportunity to perform the upstream as well as the downstream improvements that we think are necessary. All right, this is when it gets fun. So one of the other elements, and I'm a food person, so I often talk in terms of recipes or ingredients. I'll try to avoid too many of those metaphors today. But a serious influence for us, and Bob being both a psychoacoustics and a neuroscience, both student and an operations research master, so it's a pretty potent combination of things that he brings, is looking at what mathematical rules are in place and what do we know about the brain, its ability to manage nonlinear, very complex algorithms that aren't necessarily modeled well through pure math. And so you won't be able to read the 3 citations in the bottom here. I promise you there are about 12 more in one of the many AES bibliographies that Bob has put out, where you'll look at the fact that there's a consistent body of research being developed that shows time acuity inside of humans outperforms traditional thinking, right, on the uncertainty principle. And so while that math is helpful, it does not define the best methods for allowing humans to create resolution. And by resolution, we talk about separation, we talk about the ability to hear space, the things that lead to ultimate nuance inside of music. And if you're going to pick just one thing to read, if anybody hasn't read these things, the Oppenheim 2013 piece, in fact, read the abstract and a couple of pages of it and you feel like, okay, I get it, because I think it's a great one. And it also served as a launching point for a lot of other research that's happened from there, including a really great recent meta-study that was done around listening. But it very clearly speaks to humans outperforming 5 to 10, sometimes up to 50 times what the traditional mathematical models have suggested they would. And not surprisingly, the better listeners do better. It starts to really expose the fact that there's something other than just frequency when you have older musicians who really can't hear sound very well, but they listen incredibly well. And their sensitivity to the time domain starts to, in real time, perform this. The other beautiful thing about this, we don't have to debate the theory. We build tools around it and we test and we get great listeners to confirm whether we're moving in the right direction or the wrong direction. But we encourage people to do it, and it is a significant influence on the work of Bob and Peter and Malcolm in terms of what has gone into MQA. So if I were going to summarize MQA's viewpoint, and that's what this slide is to do, I won't overuse my food analogies, but if this was to be some sort of a recipe, resolution, first of all, being the human's ability to do that separation, right? Listener to separate discrete sounds. High resolution here, and I think it's critical if you want to sit in our shoes to know, we think of high resolution as a property, not as an end state. It's a property of a system, and it's an attribute of a system, rather than something that is the goal. And therefore, necessarily, bit rate and sample depth are necessary in order to get to that higher resolution, but they in themselves don't get you there. In fact, you can create tremendous resolution with much lower numbers when you focus on some of the other attributes and the dimensions based on what we know around time and its importance in resolution. Other things to be mindful of, and this is more of the commercial and productionalization, bandwidth. So what is the consumer going to be constrained by, and how do we make sure that this is accessible to people in the practical categories and channels of today? Dynamic range, and we're talking there more about the servicing of the music and the way to make sure that each sound recording is being uniquely optimized for each DAC. If you got inside of our renderer and our full decoder, you'd see that we're actually doing real-time reprogramming of the DAC based on those characteristics and what we know about that music. And that's something that we've written about, and I'd be happy to talk about more. But for us, knowing and analyzing the music and then optimizing playback about the unique characteristics of that sound recording is essential for us. And then finally, temporal blur, call it what you want. The things that impact both impulse response and the natural decay of sounds, right? Pre-ringing, post-ringing, all the things that quantization, as lovely as it can be, does to sound, those are also important considerations for us. Now I'd like you to see the kind of why we're doing it, and this will be a slightly more graceful transition because I think I embedded it.
Songs are art forms. They're pieces of art. When you create something, it's so important what I've put in comes out. I was in a songwriter session. I was the only one left in the room. There was a nice old Rhodes keyboard in the corner of the room, and I sat down. I don't even know why I played the opening chord sequence to the song I ended up playing. What came next was the opening line. Don't wait for me. Don't wait for me. Songs are like conversations. Some conversations I have with my old man, and they're not for the world, they're not for social media. But there are other songs which I don't mind sharing that conversation with the world. Better This Way is about being in a relationship and not feeling good enough for that person. And actually, sometimes the best thing to do at that point is to kind of, instead of damage the person or damage the little relationship that you have, maybe letting go of them is the best thing to do. Once I'd felt those chords and acknowledged the impact they had on me, I then tried to interpret how it made me feel. I needed to sing what I find hard to say, so I talked about my heart. So I said it in this way: what was yours was never mine. So hopefully between me and that person, they knew exactly what I was talking about. By the time we fall back into the second verse, I needed to create a feeling of falling right back into the original emotion by introducing another sound, another texture, so which was the guitar, electric guitar, and creating the crying effect. We didn't try and tidy up any of the reverbs on it or any of the effects at all. We just really wanted it to complement the piano. We wanted the guitar to be felt rather than necessarily heard. So each note sits in the piano chords, almost sinking you deeper into your seats, deeper into what the piano's playing.
I'll only hurt you again. I'll only hurt you again.
I was looking for a variation of a wailing sound, but I couldn't do it on guitar, so I ended up just DIYing it and using my voice. Not a lot going on, but in the context of things, kicks in right here. Now, unless I'd broken that down and pulled out that one sound, you would hardly notice it. But at the same time, on a bigger canvas, when all the instruments are spaced out, as it is here, it's easier to find how things are compressed or not compressed can often determine whether you pick up on details like that. And people can listen to it at the same quality that I listened to it when I was creating it and when it got mastered at a world-famous studio. That's really important to me. If I'm honest, I didn't know how to finish the song. after a while, I realized that resetting, going back to the thing I started off saying, was really important. Say what I meant to say in the first place, again.
Please don't hold your breath. Hold on to your heart instead. Your heart instead.
Okay, that's Jake Isaac. I think you may have seen that at the beginning, a great British artist who early on was exposed to MQA and made it his personal mission to get more involved, came out to office, actually wanted to be the first person to launch, as you'll hear about later, our live product, which is a real-time encoder that we used at one of his performances. But somebody who really, I think, tells the story. It was entirely unscripted. We didn't give him the words to say. He knows the subject matter. He wanted to talk about how he made music, and that was a pretty easy shoot for everybody to put together. This slide just speaks to the fact, and I know you can't read the quotes, but from a copyright holder perspective, Merlin, which represents all the independent labels on a global basis, and the three majors, have all endorsed, done deals with, and are partners with MQA. So we feel very confident about the availability of the world's catalog in MQA, and we're jointly now working with the services around the world to make sure that they get their agreements completed that enables them to use the MQA technology. I know that's a bit of an eye chart there, sorry. And this just represents the fact that back in 2016, when the RIAA had announced its definition of high resolution, it also announced technologies that it endorsed for use, and MQA was part of that. At the same time, the producers and engineers wing of the Recording Academy has put MQA into its production specifications as well. So we feel very comfortable with the creative community, the engineering community, and the copyright holders' support of MQA. So how do we do it? MQA makes its music prep tools, content encoding, if you will, available both for new releases as well as for catalog. So this very busy, overly busy visual really speaks to the fact that whether and if something is being done in a studio, the mastering studio would have access to a plugin that speaks to our cloud encoding environment, and they can use that based on their workflow. And the labels also all have licenses and implementations of MQA, both in their studios as well as in their supply chains. Each of them has a slightly different culture. I happen to know that world well, having built it at Warner, and now my team runs the Universal supply chain as well. So we know how those are integrated, and the Sony team has a slightly different approach, but all of them use MQA's tools to make sure that on a day-and-date basis, new releases and all of their catalog, including the complete 24-bit backup, is completed for them. So that's now waiting to be used in music services around the world. I guess it's worth calling out, you might be able to read the text there. When it's being monitored by a mastering engineer, they have the ability to preview and listen and approve every different playback level of MQA. So if they wanted to listen to the 16-bit version, the not unfolded version, the fully resolved version, all of those are available to them in the plugin, and they can sign off on it, and then they can actually deliver that master either directly as an MQA file, or they can actually send an additional file as a sidecar that travels along and goes into the encoding process if they have to deliver them as separate pieces. That's not really MQA's decision to make. That's a function of that label, that mastering engineer, and that producer's relationship on these projects. On the playback side, I thought it would be useful to describe the way our decoding architecture works before getting into, in fact, the best way, I meant to do this, Kenny, once before. I should have turned this into a math statement, because if you went decoder plus renderer, you essentially would be able to talk about having the full decoder. I'll start on the right. The full decoder, when implemented, and it's best implemented, but not always implemented at a hardware level, includes full decoding and rendering and authentication capability, and allows you to get all the way back to the original master resolution. The core decoder is something that's really well done in software. So as an example, that's something that Tidal recently rolled out when they did their mobile phone implementation, which means you're actually getting unfolding in that consumer app on the phone, and then it still has the ability to pass it on to a full decoding capable device that could take it all the way back. And then the renderer can be implemented individually. You probably are familiar with the Dragonflies that have capability, and there are other accessory and rendering products that you'll be hearing about as well. Why is that approach and that technology important? Because the majority of music listening, even if it's not necessarily how most of us in this room are listening, but the majority of listening is going on in smartphones and in automobiles. And so for artists and their labels to be able to take a higher quality experience to the biggest segment of the audience, they need an enabling technology that can do that. This is where I think I'll talk just for a second about MQA's efficiency. Because of the clever folded down origami packed file, on transport, it's a very low data consuming data rate file compared to the original master. And that's streamable, downloadable as well. It's streamable, which means it doesn't crush the consumer's data plan, or it doesn't, even in a broadband environment, create a problem for them if they're at home. So many people like to think about files and bandwidth as being a concern more of the music service. It's ingress, it's egress, it's storage. Yes, it's all that, but it's also, particularly in the mobile consumer space, an incredibly important concern if you want to get higher quality to somebody's phone. This is that slide that I would say, take a picture if you're interested in having a simple synopsis of the various MQA use cases. It's also because I could talk for an hour and a half on this slide, and I promise you I won't. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. Sometimes we forget to talk about the fact that MQA as a file plays everywhere. Because MQA is both totally open, does not have any DRM, and it can be wrapped in a lossless wrapper, anywhere FLAC or ALAC or WAV will play, an MQA file will play. Right? That unlocks about 5 billion devices in the world right now, approximately, because of the footprint of those. And so the bottom right hand of this speaks to the fact that even if you have a legacy component that knows nothing about MQA, an MQA file will play on it. The more interesting stuff, I think, becomes when you look at the top, where an MQA file can be delivered to a legacy component, and as long as it can pass it through, if you're sitting in a home audio system and you have a bit perfect component and it sends it through to an MQA capable device, it will go, I know you, there's work to be done on you, and then it begins the unfold and the rendering process. So because we pass that intelligence through, we're able to navigate clean pipes everywhere. It's incredibly helpful in the custom audio space. Thank you. Happy to talk about this much more afterward in other places. I am running a little close on time, and I want to see if there's any questions in the audience. And then finally, that architecture and that approach allows us, luckily, to be able to present it to you everywhere that you might listen. You may have seen some recent announcements at CES about MQA, QNX, BlackBerry, and some of our automotive partners. We've been really fortunate with our relationship with LG in the smartphone space. Our biggest, earliest, and most passionate partner being the team in Toronto, or Pickering, more properly Lynbrook, NAD, and Blue OS have been a tremendous partner of ours. You'll see some of their products here as well. Today we have over 70 licensed CE partnerships. We have products in every major market around the world. There isn't a major market where there aren't multiple MQA-enabled CE devices already in the market. So it's a pretty interesting time, and it's still early days for us. And then finally, I guess this is my version of stay tuned. Some of you might have been aware that we introduced our real-time encoder March of 2018. I mentioned Jake Isaac earlier, who played at the first MQA Live event. We're pretty excited about the reaction that we're getting from broadcasters and promoters who are planning to use MQA as their live and audio platform for both audio only and audio video live events. And things that we haven't announced yet, but it's consuming a lot of the engineering team's time right now, and so will be some very interesting things that we'll announce before out of calendar 2019.